the true queen of writing, the author of The Young Lion. Will you make her welcome, the fabulous Blanche D'Arpouget?
I think Sir Kevin is perhaps a Tudor. Welcome to this cool afternoon in Woodford. I would like to begin by asking Andrew and Siobhan, and then all of you, please, to close your eyes, because we're going to try time travel backwards. And if you have your eyes open when we're travelling at warp speed backwards, you're likely to get giddy. So please close your eyes. Have you got your eyes? Yes, yes, good. We go back 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 600 years, 629 years. Richard III is killed in battle. We keep going. Richard III, of course, was the last of the Plantagenet kings. Bad luck. 700 years, 800 years, 900, 910, 920, 930, 940. I'll hurry this up. 951, 52, 53, 959 years. We've arrived, but please keep your eyes shut, because I need to orient you as to where you are. You've arrived in the 12th century in 1154, and it's a very cold but bright day in December. You're in London, and you're in Westminster Abbey. You can open your eyes now. You're here for the coronation of the Duke of Normandy, Henry, who will become Henry II of England, and beside him is his beautiful wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was said to be the richest and most beautiful woman in Europe. And a few years hence, a German student will write about her: "If all the world were mine, from the seashore to the Rhine, I'd count it as nothing to have the Queen of England lying in my arms." They were romantic times. For the first time in Europe, the concept of romantic love between men and women, when the woman was an adored creature whose affections had to be sought continually, whose kisses could be pursued for years and years and perhaps never earned. The church insisted, of course, that all sex outside marriage was sinful. But the troubadours, the songwriters and poets of those days, said that all sex and love, including adultery, was blissful and to be sought. And it would lead to the highest bliss for those who attained it. There was a very interesting and wondrous difference between the 12th century and the 20th century. There were no sexually transmittable diseases. And also, being illegitimate wasn't a problem. After all, William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England who unified the country and who was Henry's great-grandfather, was illegitimate, and is also known in England still to this day as William the Bastard. So there were no sexually transmitted diseases. It would be another 150 years before Crusaders brought back what was known then and is still known today as the clap from the Middle East. It would be hundreds of years more before syphilis arrived from the Americas. So sex was a joyful and carefree occupation, and it was undertaken with great vigour by many people of all classes. It was only extremely recently that the clergy had declared themselves celibate. Until 150 years previously, the clergy had been married, and indeed in the 12th century, many of them still were, but their wives were known as housekeepers, and their sons and daughters were known as nieces and nephews. In fact, the first Pope, Peter, was married, as had been all clerics until very recently. And in the 12th century, as I said, many still were. The 12th century was a time of great blossoming. 1,000 flowers bloomed, as it were, and that was much in thanks to the Crusades, to the Crusaders who brought back from the Middle East the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome that had been lost when the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Europe fell into the Dark Ages. But by the 12th century, by the 11th century, in fact, that knowledge was returning to Europe, and there was an enormous fascination with the writings of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. And there was an intellectual and philosophical ferment going on at this time. There were other marvellous aspects of the 12th century, which is often called a Renaissance, and people think of the Renaissance as being the 16th century Italian Renaissance, but in fact there was a 12th century Renaissance. The great Gothic cathedrals were being built. The first of the great universities were being built. In Paris, what became known as the Sorbonne, because of the family who owned the land, was opening. In England, it was Oxford was opening. At this stage, they weren't called universities, they were called guilds of masters and students. Besides wonderful cathedrals, Chartres was commenced then. Notre Dame was just beginning to be built. It would take hundreds of years. There were marvellous castles, many of which survived hundreds of years of war. Dover Castle, which Henry II built, survived bombing during the Second World War. And there were great other innovations in thought, in music, in relations between men and women, and in social life itself. But while the ideal of romantic love, Gothic cathedrals and wonderful architecture were the great and lasting blessings that have come to us from the 12th century, there was something that was even greater that we enjoy today, and that was the rule of law. It was Henry II of England, at whose coronation we've just turned up, who introduced to the world the idea of the rule of law and who established the British common law. And if we turn on the television today, we see the effect in those countries which do not have the rule of law and the barbarous suffering and violence from which they cannot yet escape. There are many things I could say about the 12th century, but I'd like to make an important point. It's commonly believed that people of those days were the size of hobbits and lived to the age of 30 or 40. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, 12th century English women, it's known from graves, were slightly taller and stronger than 20th century English women. nor did they live to short lives. And of course, women died in childbirth, men died in battle, and battle was pretty continuous during these periods, these decades. And they died from blood poisoning and from fevers. Nobody knows what these fevers were. They were just called fevers. But if you didn't die from childbirth, if you're a woman, or from an infection, you had a very good chance of living to a ripe old age. Pope Pius III, for example, lived to 93. Eleanor, Henry's wife, had 11 children and lived to the age of 81. One of Henry's ancestors, a duke, died, according to his gravestone, from ceaseless toil at the age of 80. As to their size, I mentioned that the women of the 12th century were larger and stronger than women of the 20th century, English women that is. So the men were very big too. For example, Eleanor's son, Richard the Lionheart, one of her number of sons, who was always portrayed by Hollywood as swarthy and chunky and brooding, was in fact 6'5", blonde and gay. Being gay in the 12th century was not the scandal that it would become in later decades. There's another reason why people then lived healthy lives. They all ate organic food, to start with, like us here. They had a great deal of exercise. Either they rode horses, or they walked, or they were labouring in fields. And they had one of the most unusual characteristics that again, Hollywood always misrepresents. They tended to have perfect teeth. I don't know if you, and of course, rotten teeth is one of the great causes of illness and death. I don't know if you noticed when Richard III's skeleton was discovered beneath a London car park earlier this year, that he had a perfect set of even teeth, except for the left front incisor, this one. Probably knocked out by a right-handed blow from a man who went on to kill him. It would not be for another several hundred years before something happened in England that was to cause these beautiful teeth to deteriorate and to bring disease to people. And I hate to have to tell you this, but it was sugar. And the sugar was used then very sparingly as a medicine. And perhaps that's what we should be going back to today. I hate to tell the ice cream people that. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'll talk to you a little later. And now the lovely Siobhan will play a beautiful troubadour song, Plaisir d'amour, and then I think another one. Thank you, Siobhan.
This next song is from a new ballet by a man called Alain Simon in France, and it's about Isolde, the Princess of Ireland, begging her father to please let her not marry the very old King of Cornwall and instead marry his son, the Prince of Cornwall, Tristan. This is called My Father.
Oh, hear the song of my fatherland, from Cornwall to desert sand. Give me your strength, give me your faith, give me your vision and your hopes. Many sorrows and many tears, bless me, my father, I'm not free. I love Tristan from Brittany, from Brittany. Mon péché léger par mon sang, j'aime Tristan depuis longtemps. Je poserai mon en pleurant, en pleurant. Are you crazy? Are you foolish? I am your father, said the king. You will be married to King Mark. You will be married for your country. Many sorrows and many tears. Bless me, my father, I'm not free. I love Tristan from Brittany, from Brittany. Mon péché léger par mon sang, j'aime Tristan depuis longtemps. Je poserai mon en pleurant, en pleurant. Are you crazy? Are you foolish? I am your father, said the king.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you, Siobhan. That was beautiful. And she captured that mood. We started off with arriving for Henry II's coronation. I would like now to read to you something from the book that gives you the backstory to how we got to that point. 2.5 years after leaving for Jerusalem, in the winter of 1149, the humiliated remnants of the army of the Second Crusade traipsed home to the Ile-de-France. A leaden December sky made spirits sink into deeper gloom. The vanguard was 10 leagues from Paris, but dusk was already upon them, so the coming night would be spent in the only available accommodation, a monastery. The infantry would pitch tents in fields nearby. The cavalry would sleep in monk cells, the monarchs in the apartments set aside for the use of bishops. "Is freezing, princess," the queen complained. She addressed a falcon she carried on her gauntlet. Through the weeks of miserable homeward travel, she'd cast the bird many times each day, whooping with excitement when it brought down a young crane or a duck. She'd schooled her favourite, a maid from Byzantium, in how to swing the lure to call princess from the sky. But this day there had been no prey and no excitement, just dreary plodding through a grey winter forest. Absolutely freezing, she muttered. One of her knights offered to return to the sumpter horses and wagon about an hour away to fetch her Minerva cloak. As he wheeled his horse, a rider slightly to the right of the Queen and her knights spurred his mount towards her. Approaching, he dropped the reins, controlling his horse with his knees as he swept from his shoulders a cloak of green wool lined with soft grey badger fur. "Your Highness, please take it," he called. Her knights, men of Aquitaine and Poitou, gave him hard looks, but let him through. The Queen passed her falcon to the maid, ripped off her gauntlet, and fastened the cloak at her neck. It was warm from the man's body and smelled pleasant. "You won't be cold?" she asked. Her tone indicated she did not care if he were. "I'm never cold, Your Highness." He gave her a bold white smile and doffed his velvet hat. She noticed a sprig of broom decorated its brim. Amusing, she thought. The knights jerked their chins at him, letting him know the audience was over and that he and his manservant, carrying his pennant of yellow leopards on a blue ground, were to fall back, away from the Queen. "Find out who he is," Eleanor said to her maid, Zena. And then, later that night, there were 2 large chambers in the Queen's apartment. The main sleeping chamber was richly furnished, with a wide and comfortable bed, fit for an archbishop, a velvet-covered prayer stool, and a looking-glass from Lombardy. The smaller chamber was suitable for an archdeacon or a maid. Zena had made the sleeping platform comfortable with pillows and some extra furs. This more modest chamber opened onto a garden where some evergreen shrubs screened it from an open field, and beyond the field, the oak forest they had traversed that day. There were 2 guards outside the door to the Queen's sleeping quarters, but no one guarded the small garden or the maid's chamber behind it. It was into this garden that Geoffrey le Bel, Geoffrey the handsome, Duke of Normandy, stepped while supper was served in the monastery dining hall. Zena opened the door to him and fled to Eleanor's bed. The only light was from 2 charcoal braziers, and a votive candle she had lit and left burning near the doorway to the garden. Geoffrey's heart pounded. Not long ago, and not far from here, Peter Abelard had been castrated for sexual impropriety. If this is an ambush, he thought, I'm dead. Henry, my son, if I'm to die, don't judge me as the world will judge, as a lecherous knave. Know that what I'm doing is for our cause. He calmed himself by softly humming the refrain, a brave death, not a coward's life. Momentarily, a shadow crossed the light of the braziers, but whether it was a woman's or a man's, it moved too quickly for him to tell. That's the prologue, and this is chapter 1. Perhaps it was the fever of the times. 2.5 years earlier, in the high summer of 1147, the very moment when the Christian army in France set out with fervent hopes for Jerusalem, a strange event occurred in England. The English had eschewed joining the Second Crusade because they had troubles enough of their own, especially the king, and senior members of the baronage. In the old Palace of Winchester, that fateful summer morning, King Stephen and his heir, Prince Eustace, answered an urgent warning from a royal guard. The monarch and his son stationed themselves behind two arrow-slit windows to peer down into the palace courtyard. From their position, they could observe, while remaining invisible themselves, two young strangers who had arrived a short time before and were waiting to be invited inside. They were well mounted but travel-soiled. One, it appeared, was the master, the other, his squire. Both were tall, slim, and despite their youth, already elegantly muscular. The squire was dark-haired, while the master had a red-gold mane that flashed like metal in the sunshine. The king felt a chill. He knew that hair. Centuries pass, but Viking blood announces itself like the blast of a trumpet. Although Prince Eustace was only 20, his lips had a curl of cynicism. He suspected he knew who these strangers were, both so plainly dressed they could be taken for merchants, even artisans. Except for their fine boots and their horses, no one would believe they were men of rank. A servant dashed along the stone corridor with a note for the king. Eustace glimpsed the name at the foot of the page and knew his suspicion was correct. Their visitors were the terrible brothers, the one with flaming hair claiming through his mother the right to the English throne. Just months earlier, he had invaded the south of the country, leading a group of young barons and counts, none above the age of 18, and 200 Flemish mercenaries. His second in command, the squire, in the courtyard, was his bastard half-brother, Guillaume, another son of the execrable Duke of Normandy. My father should kill them both, Eustace thought. That destrier worth a fortune, he remarked, his eye fixed on a bay stallion. I wonder from whom he stole it. Eustace, the king tutted. He did not dare show Eustace the letter he held. The grandson of King Henry, the Lion, had the gall to ask for money to pay for his mercenaries and sail home. He wishes to call on me to apologise, Stephen told his son. Who's the mother of that other youth, I wonder? The Crown Prince snorted. A laundry maid, a countess, one of his own nieces. Geoffrey the Handsome was now 33 years old and said to have sired already as many bastards as the Lion. He was known for wearing a sprig of yellow broom in his hat. King Stephen thought flaunting a roadside weed as if it were a peacock feather sheer effrontery. Prince Eustace beckoned a guard and murmured an order. Watch this, he told his father. The guard sauntered out to the glare of the courtyard below, where Henry and Guillaume had dismounted and were now sitting on the horse trough. Etched on a wall was a list of his grandfather's successful battles. He felt naked as he read them, ashamed of his folly in attacking southern England without a proper plan of battle. Failure was inevitable, he now realised. The guard Prince Eustace had summoned carried a pitcher of light ale into the courtyard. It's an hot day. Have a drink, dog. He flung the pitcher in Henry's face. As the boy's eyes closed to avoid the ale, the guard threw a punch at his nose, but Henry was agile, and the blow caught only his left eyebrow. A rivulet of blood mixed with ale ran down his cheek. Henry turned his back on the guard, and Guillaume did the same. In the dark of the palace, King Stephen turned in embarrassment to his son. "My dear," he said, "he's only a boy." Eustace was enraged. He had wanted Henry, and honoured that demanded he should, to strike the guard back. Members of the regiment would then have an excuse to beat him properly there in the courtyard where everyone could watch. "A boy who wants my throne," the prince replied. "Your throne, father," he corrected himself. The banners of noble houses hung from the ceiling of the tall, dim audience chamber, the Winchester Keep. Built of stone, it remained cool even in the height of summer. Courtiers and princes of the church filed in to take their places according to rank for the midsummer court. The bishops and a few of the older earls and barons sat on benches, but mostly the court stood. A layer of rushes softened the floor. All the laity were dressed in bright summer colours, greens and pinks, blues and yellows, lavenders and whites. The women covered their hair with veils that matched or contrasted with their gowns. Only the clergy wore sombre garments, although some of the deacons were as gaily dressed as the rest of the court. Young pages stood around, alert for a beckoning finger. As they'd entered the palace grounds, riding on horseback or in coaches, many courtiers had noted the youths sitting on the horse trough in the courtyard, and a few had guessed their identity. A wave of speculation and gossip reared and crashed against the stone walls. Could it be? Was it really? How dare he? What did he want? What a nerve! The king waited until a reading plank was placed across his knees. Then he rolled out Henry's letter and silently studied it. Morning light came from uncovered windows behind the throne to fall on the document. The chamber hushed to respectful silence, except for the prelates who fingered rosaries and gossiped quietly among themselves. Courtiers fidgeted and stared at the king, or summoned pages to bring them a fan or a refreshment. Someone trod on a little dog belonging to one of the ladies. It gave a howl and rushed between people's legs, whimpering. Prince Eustace glared at the woman and whispered something to his page. The child left his side and a few minutes later carried the squirming puppy outdoors, where it howled for minutes from the kicking he gave it. The king had now read the letter 4 times. He sighed, and his small pink lips moved as if forming a prayer. The hush evaporated as courtiers, one after another, commented to each other that His Highness seemed worried. At last he looked up. "Bring him in," he ordered. The court stared in wonderment. The boy who entered could have been the lion from 50 years ago, clad once more in the garment of flesh. For some, a frisson of excitement shook them. In others, bowels turned cold. "Not even a beard yet," men muttered, "but a scoundrel, same as his father." Much as they wanted to think of him as a mere lout who had failed in his first military adventure, they could not help admiring the confidence with which he strode towards the king. His bright hair, a copper abundance that fell to his shoulders. In dirty clothes, his face bleeding and ruddy from the heat, he looked more of a prince than pale Eustace, whose robe was edged with ermine and whose shoes tinkled with jewellery. The courtiers saw that the youth's hard jaw and blue stare, but only his brother saw that his heart was as awed as an altar boy's entering a great cathedral. A deacon whispered to his archbishop, "He's actually very nervous." "You read people well, Tom," the prelate murmured. I see Eustace has fixed on that large blue sapphire set in gold on the boy's middle finger," he continued. A few of the older earls knew whose ring it had been, although none had seen it on the hand of its original owner. Prince Eustace stared in disbelief. William the Conqueror, the first Norman King of England, was his ancestor too. "How dare you wear stolen goods in my presence?" he demanded. Henry smiled slightly. "Stolen, cousin?" He turned away. He had a straight nose, the courtiers could see, and straight brows bleached fair by the sun. But he remained standing in front of the king, so mostly they saw his back. Guillaume stood slightly behind him, but Eustace pointed to a wall, ordering him away. As he stepped back, women and some clerks remarked on Guillaume's modesty and beauty. Stephen smoothed his silver hair. "You wrote this yourself?" he asked. "I did." "Your Highness," Eustace hissed. "I wrote it, Your Highness." Henry ignored him. "You have studied well," the king continued. "Thank you, uncle." "Uncle?" The prince leapt to his feet. "How dare you address my father as uncle in the presence of his court?" For a moment his eyes fastened on Henry's hard blue stare before he rushed from the audience chamber. Courtiers stopped breathing. Even the bishops were disconcerted. Their fingers hovered motionless over their rosaries. Henry glanced after Eustace as if at a curiosity one might see at a fair. His cool look was deceptive. He seethed with excitement. At last he had seen the face and begun to take the measure of the man he must defeat to win the throne. Thank you very much. Thanks.